Hello guys, welcome back. So today we'll be starting with a new topic, that is cranial fossas and dural venous sinuses. So let's know about the cranial fossas. Fossas, I've said you before also, fossas mean depression kind of thing, okay? So our cranium is divided into three main cranial fossas. Here I have highlighted them already, I'll be naming them. The purple color which you see over here, it is the anterior cranial fossa. Now this anterior cranial fossa comprises of few bones, that is your frontal bone along with the frontal lobe and the ethmoidal bone, okay? Anterior cranial fossa. As you can see, this is the ethmoid bone. I've said you previously, right? You can see few holes in it, right? So these are the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. From here, your olfactory nerve will enter the cranium, okay? From the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Understood? Then this pink color part is the middle cranial fossa. It is situated in the middle, hence that the middle cranial fossa, comprising of the sphenoid bone, the butterfly-shaped bone. This lateral part is the temporal bone, comprising with the temporal lobes, fine? And then you have this at the posterior part, the posterior cranial fossa. This consists of your brainstem. What was brainstem? Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. You see this hole, big hole, I've said, big means magnum, hole means foramen, so it is foramen magnum. It is also into your posterior cranial fossa. And the main bone is the occipital bone. So what will be the lobe? It is occipital lobe, present over here, okay? And there are few things that you need to know in this diagram. So I'm erasing this part. You see this thing in between? This is the body of the sphenoid bone. Okay, so this is the body of sphenoid bone. I'm explaining you these things over here because in the next slide we'll be doing about what are dural venous sinuses. And for you to understand it very clearly, you need to know what things are situated where. Okay, so this is the body of sphenoid bone. In the previous video, or when we were doing meninges, I clearly explained you that there's diaphragma sellae. This diaphragma sellae consists of stalk of pituitary gland. So you see this portion, the depressed portion over here. Okay, this depressed portion, it is the hypophyseal fossa. It is the hypophyseal fossa. Now this hypophyseal fossa is the chair we can see for the pituitary gland. So your pituitary gland sits over here. Okay, so this hypophyseal fossa here, what is located? Your pituitary gland is located. Remember this? Okay. And there's something in the occipital part, or we can say in the posterior cranial fossa part. Can you see this? Green color structures entering into the skull or exiting from the skull. This structure is coming or exiting, we can say, through a foramen. This foramen is the jugular foramen. This foramen is known as jugular foramen. From here, the internal jugular vein will exit. What is internal jugular vein? It will take all of the venous drainage from your brain. Then it will go and drain into the subclavian vein. The subclavian vein will then go and drain into the brachiocephalic vein. This brachiocephalic vein then drains into the superior vena cava, which will open into your right atrium. So all of the deoxygenated blood which is present into the vein will go into the superior vena cava, then into the right atrium, and there they will then move to get oxygenated into the heart and into the lungs. Okay. So this is the jugular foramen you need to remember. So this was some of the parts you need to know for the dural venous sinuses. There's one more thing, this part. While we were doing meninges, I also explained you a falx cerebri. This falx cerebri divides the two cerebral hemispheres. It divides the bigger cerebrum, right, the big brain of us, into two right and left equal halves. Okay, so one right half, one left hemisphere. So you can see this is one hemisphere. The other part it's not shown over here. Okay, in between these two hemispheres, this is the falx cerebri. Okay. And when we were doing bones, I explained you that there are two parietal bones which are joined by a suture known as sagittal suture. And beneath or under that sagittal suture was situated the superior sagittal sinus. Now this superior sagittal sinus, I told you to remember it very clearly, right? So consider it that there's a bone above. Okay. Consider it that there's a bone above and there's this superior sagittal sinus I said you before. Okay. And there's something called as inferior sagittal sinus. Superior sagittal sinus was present where? It was present right beneath the sagittal suture. Right? Now this inferior sagittal sinus, I am drawing it over here, this orange colored part. The inferior sagittal sinus is present below the falx cerebri. So this is the location of the inferior sagittal sinus which I wanted to explain you in this way. Okay, sagittal sinus present below the falx cerebri. And where was superior sagittal sinus present? It was present below the superior sagittal suture. Okay, now let's move on with the dural venous sinuses. Before moving on with the dural venous sinuses, there are things that you must remember. Okay, so let's know a few things about the dural venous sinuses in detail. The first is that it is located. I've already explained you about where it is located, but I'm repeating it again. It is located between the periosteal layer and periosteal and meningeal layer of dura mater. Okay, understood? Then it is lined by endothelium. You must remember that there are no valves and no muscles present in the wall. Okay, and we have some veins inside our skull, and so does we have outside of our skull, right? So these veins connect. So the outside veins will connect with the internal veins of the skull through the veins which are known as emissary veins. So this dural venous sinus or you can say cranial sinus or cranial venous system, communicates with outside vein or with veins outside the skull, you can say outside vein through emissary veins. Okay, so the veins which connects the outside veins and the internal skull veins is known as emissary veins. So remember this name, emissary veins. Okay, it's important. Let's start with the dural venous sinus. See, here I'll be explaining you a very simplified version of the dural venous sinuses. Okay, and I'll be explaining you it in detail. So if anybody wants to just know which sinus will drain where, and at the end where all of this venous blood will go to, then you can skip to the last part. I'll be explaining you into the summary. I'll be giving you a quick summary to remember it. It will be in a form of flowchart. That will be very easy. But if you want to know exactly how these things are happening, then you must watch the whole video. Okay. So I'll be starting with the sphenoid bone. So first of all, let me tell you which view we are seeing of the skull. So you remember this view, right? This view is the base of the skull view. Okay, we are seeing the base of the skull, right? Or the, we can say, inferior view of the skull, interior view of the skull. So keep that view in mind, and I'm explaining you through that view itself. Okay, so you have this sphenoid bone. This is the body of sphenoid bone. What it is? Body of sphenoid. Doesn't matter if you don't have color pencils or color pens, you can draw only with the help of one pen you have, or if you have pencil, then use that too. Okay, I am drawing a different color so that you understand it very well. It is not compulsory for you to have different color pens to draw it. Okay, so body of sphenoid bone. I'm drawing the sinus. The first sinus which is important, that is the cavernous sinus. Okay, so this is C-A-V-E-R-N-O-U-S, cavernous. Understood? So this is what sinus. It is present on each side of the body. One on the left side, one on the right side. So left cavernous sinus and the right cavernous sinus. Okay, now there's a structure which will open, which will drain into this sinus. This is known as sphenoparietal sinus. Okay, so there's left sphenoparietal, right sphenoparietal will drain respectively into the cavernous sinus. Left into left, right into right. Now this cavernous sinus itself forms two intercavernous sinus. So you must remember that also. On the anterior side will be called anterior intercavernous sinus. This is anterior intercavernous sinus. This is posterior intercavernous sinus. Okay, anterior to the body, anterior intercavernous sinus, connecting two cavernous, right? So intercavernous and posterior intercavernous. Now this cavernous sinus will give you two things. I'll name them. First, I am drawing a transverse sinus. Now you should know something, that this transverse sinus is C-shaped and it is present in the occipital bone. Okay, as your occipital bone from the behind side is round, right? You can see in this picture, wait. So it is round, right? So this is how the cavernous sinus. I'll be explaining you this in this bony structure also. This sinus will be doing it again over there as a revision part. So this is the transverse sinus. Now this transverse sinus, when it moves inward, it turns into a S shape that is known as sigmoid sinus. What it is known as? Sigmoid sinus. So you must remember that. So the structures which I haven't named, I'm naming them now. So this one which you see, this is the superior Petrossal sinus. What it is named? Petrossal sinus, superior one. This one is the inferior Petrossal sinus. What it is? Inferior Petrossal sinus. This light blue color, it is the transverse sinus. What it is? Transverse sinus. And this orange color which you see, it is the sigmoid sinus. What it is? S shape, right? Sigmoid sinus. Now there's this thing. The sigmoid sinus will become something that is internal jugular vein. What it will turn into? Internal jugular vein. In previous slide, I explained you this internal jugular vein will then exit the skull through the jugular foramen. But before it exits, as soon as it becomes an internal jugular vein, it is dilated. It becomes dilated. Now this dilated portion is of this internal jugular vein. We call it as jugular bulb. What do we call the dilated portion of the internal jugular vein? Jugular bulb. Then it will exit through the jugular foramen. Okay. Now, about this inferior and superior Petrossal sinus. This superior Petrossal sinus, as you can see, I have merged it with the transverse sinus. So the superior Petrossal sinus drains into the transverse sinus. This inferior Petrossal sinus will drain into the sigmoid sinus. Okay. And this transverse sinus will then further drain into sigmoid sinus, and then sigmoid sinus will turn into internal jugular vein, which will then exit out from your skull. So this was all of the outflow of the venous sinuses. This was the basal view. Which view it was? It was the basal view, or we can say top view. We are looking at from the top. Okay. Now I'm showing you a transverse view. Sorry, not transverse, lateral view. Let's look, because there are a few more sinuses that you need to know. Very easy, don't worry. So I'm drawing one thing. Okay, this is the superior sagittal sinus. Now this superior sagittal sinus is right under the parietal bones, right? Now when it enters it will then enter into the occipital bone and then mix with the transverse sinus. So this transverse sinus and sigmoid sinus both are present in the occipital bone, you should remember, okay? Now the superior sagittal sinus I've drawn. Now let's draw the inferior sagittal sinus. I've explained you where was the inferior sagittal sinus present. It was present right below the falx cerebri. So I'm drawing the inferior sagittal sinus. So this is the inferior sagittal sinus, okay? I am giving this yellow straight line also. One more line I'm drawing. This is actually the straight sinus. What it is? It is straight sinus. Now this inferior sagittal sinus becomes straight. So when it becomes straight, we name it as straight sinus. Okay. Now we'll draw again the transverse sinus, the same color I'm using which I've used before. Okay. Now let's make the sigmoid sinus of it. Then the sigmoid sinus will drain where? In the internal jugular vein, or it will turn into internal jugular vein. Understood? Now there was something very important. What am I forgetting? It is the cavernous sinus. Okay. So now I'm drawing the cavernous sinus. This circle part is the cavernous sinus. Something was entering the cavernous sinus, right? It was the sphenoparietal sinus. Understood? Now this cavernous sinus was giving two things. One was superior petrossal sinus and one was inferior petrossal sinus. Right? Superior petrossal sinus directly drained into the which part? It directly drained into the transverse part, transverse sinus, and the inferior petrossal sinus drained into the sigmoid sinus. I'm naming them, starting with the transverse sinus first. So this is the transverse sinus. Okay, this white color first I'll name. It is the internal jugular vein. This is the sphenoparietal sinus. Okay, now let's name the inferior petrossal sinus. This is the inferior petrossal sinus, and this is the superior petrossal sinus. So which sinus we did more? Superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus. These were the sinuses that I didn't cover when we were doing the basal view. That's why I made this diagram. This is also a simplified version. Okay, superior petrossal sinus, and there is one thing that we are forgetting, the very important one. This is what? This is the cavernous sinus. Okay, understood? So this was the simplified view of it, and there's one thing that I have forgotten. So can you see here, this portion? Here three sinuses are meeting. So this portion is known as confluences of sinuses. Confluences of sinuses. It consists of three sinuses. I'm naming them. First, you can see this superior sagittal sinus, right? The superior sagittal sinus will meet with the transverse sinus. The second sinus we can see is the straight sinus, meeting again at that point with the transverse sinus, straight sinus. And then the third thing, that is the transverse sinus itself. Okay, so this three sinus where it meets, we call it as confluences of sinuses. Understood? I'm doing this basal view. We can only do this basal view in this bony part. Understood? So I'm drawing here all the sinuses once again, and in the next slide I'll give you that flow chart which I was talking about in the beginning. From there, that is the only part for the revision part. So you will easily understand what drains into where. But this was, you should know where which sinus is located, how they are going. Okay, this understanding will make it more easier for you to understand the flow chart. So without wasting time, let's start again with this. So this was the body of the sphenoid bone, right? Body of the sphenoid bone. Let's draw the cavernous sinus. So here is present your cavernous sinus. What it is present? Here is the cavernous sinus present. Understood? On the sides of the body. There was sphenoparietal sinuses entering this cavernous sinus. And this cavernous sinus is self-connected front in the anterior side with the anterior intercavernous sinus and posteriorly with the posterior intercavernous sinus. Now the transverse sinus. Let's see first the transverse sinus. You see this groove or some protruded like things? This is the transverse sinus. What it is? Here is the transverse sinus exactly present. I said it is half moon shaped or semi-lunar shaped. Understood? So this is the transverse sinus. Now the transverse sinus this is the midline, consider it. On the left hand side will be called left transverse sinus, on the right hand side will be called the right transverse sinus. Understood? Now the sigmoid sinus. This transverse sinus will then turn into the sigmoid sinus. What it will turn into? Sigmoid sinus. Understood? Then the sigmoid sinus will become what? It will become the jugular vein. Understood? I'm not taking that green color structure as internal jugular vein. Okay, I'm trying to use the same colors which I've used over here for you to understand it very easily. Okay, so this white color part is the internal jugular vein. I'll be naming it everything in the last. Now let's draw this superior petrossal sinus and the inferior petrossal. The cavernous sinus will give superior petrossal sinus, which will come and meet to the transverse sinus. Okay, now this inferior petrossal sinus will directly come and meet with the sigmoid sinus. Understood? So this was about all the dural venous sinus. And you have something, one more thing I forgot to tell you in the beginning. That is this. This is the occipital sinus. Okay, so this is the occipital sinus. I'll write over there also, so add it in that diagram also. Here you have in between the occipital sinus. Okay, understood? Okay. So let's name all the sinuses. I'm naming all of them with the green color. Okay, so this yellow is cavernous sinus. This orange is sphenoparietal sinus. Then you have this anterior intercavernous sinus. This is posterior intercavernous sinus. Then you have superior petrossal sinus, which will drain where? It will drain into the transverse sinus. Superior petrossal. Then you have this one, which is inferior petrossal sinus. Then you have this as transverse sinus. Occipital, I've named it with white color. Okay, so don't forget that. Transverse sinus. This orange is sigmoid sinus. And this white is what it is. I'll write it on this side. Internal jugular vein. What it is? Internal jugular vein. And internal jugular vein in the beginning is, it is dilated. And the dilated is known as what? Jugular bulb. Internal jugular vein. Okay? Understood? So this was all about dural venous sinuses. Let's do that review part of it. Okay? The flow chart. Come on. Very easy. So this is the summary of it. Summary of venous sinuses. So you have superior sagittal sinus. I'll start with a different color. Superior sagittal sinus. Okay. It goes and drains into a structure called as transverse sinus. In the transverse sinus will drain one more thing, that is occipital sinus. And this transverse sinus will then form what? It will form the sigmoid sinus, which will then form what? Internal jugular vein. Okay. Now then superior sagittal sinus, then what was that? Inferior sagittal sinus, which will go and drain into the straight sinus. 1 minute. It will go and drain into the straight sinus. The straight sinus will then further drain where? It will drain into the transverse sinus. Understood? Now the cavernous sinus. Before that, let's do the sphenoparietal sinus. The sphenoparietal sinus will drain into cavernous sinus. The cavernous sinus will give two things, right? It will give two things. First, let's do the superior petrossal sinus. Draining where? It will drain into the transverse sinus. Then you have this inferior petrossal sinus. Draining where? Into the sigmoid sinus. So this is the review of it, or the summary of it from where you can learn. And then this transverse sinus, where all of them were meeting. This is called as confluence of sinuses. Understood? See, occipital opening, superior sagittal opening, straight sinus opening, superior petrossal opening. Understood? So this is the confluence of sinuses. I hope everything is clear now.